let's be honest, life can be very simple. Usually it's not though, but maybe that is why we can appreciate simple things so much. Like huge mechs beating up huge monsters, aka Kaijus. I mean, it doesn't get more simpler than that, yet it can't be more awesome than that either. So when a friend of mine told me of some random game that had the premise of Mechs versus Kaijus, I had to check it out and move potentially everything else I had planned aside. Unfortunately, life itself thought the exact same thing and decided to push my plans out of the way with some unexpected turns. Thankfully, I bought this game on the Switch, and when you're constantly on the move, having a Switch is great. Now, if the game itself is also great, or at least manages to be good, is what we will find out in this review. But I mean, it's Mechs versus Kaijus. It's really simple and impossible to mess up, right? Ooh, yeah, well, let's cross our fingers and see what 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim has to offer. It's the year 1985 when Earth is invaded by Kaijus from outer space, and it's up to 13 Japanese high schoolers that can control these large mechs called Sentinels to stop these Kaijus from destroying mankind. And that is it. Yeah, as I said, life can be that simple. Or is it? 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim presents its story as something like this simple, but in reality it has a lot more depth to it, and I do mean a lot more. 13 Sentinels' story is not a traditional linear story where you follow a main character and some sides and have a plot unfold as you go along with them in their adventure. Instead, I would call its story an interactive puzzle or a mystery solver. Because everything the game shows, tells, does, and gives you in the story are basically puzzle pieces. Puzzle pieces you need to use to figure out, reconstruct, and connect together to actually make and understand the story that is told here, as the story by itself won't do that for you. Which normally I'm not the biggest fan of, as games that try to do this usually fail at it or create a sense of wasting your time and effort. But the way 13 Sentinels did it pulled me in and challenged me with a very clever, intriguing and fun mystery solver of a story. The fun starts right away as the story thrusts you into confusion by starting at the beginning of the final act of the story. We have no clue what is going on, who these characters are, or what we are doing. All we get is a tutorial for the combat, some small bits of terms, names, lore, and story, and then we are sent off into one of the 13 storylines this game has to offer. Of course, each storyline is connected to one of the 13 characters. Now, do not misunderstand, while these storylines are heavily connected with each other and are working towards the same point, they will not start to answer many of your questions right from the start. A matter of fact, after the first few hours exploring these storylines, chances are you are even more confused by what is going on and what kind of story is being told here. It literally felt like jumping down, or more like falling down, a rabbit hole. These 13 storylines are all told in bite-sized pieces, and the events are not shown in chronological order, and many key events of certain characters are not shown in their own storyline, but in someone else's. And if that didn't sound chaotic enough, 13 Sentinels does not shy away from flipping the board completely upside down from time to time, with new revelations, perspectives, or plot twists. Now, thankfully, the game does give you a lot of tools required to overcome these moments, or to just keep track of the whole story altogether. There is, of course, a codex system which is very easy to read and straight to the point. And as you progress, it constantly gets updated with new information. Then there is the writing itself, which in my opinion is what made this story so much fun and interesting to experience. It mastered the art of lifting the tip of the veil just enough to keep you invested with new information or things, while at the same time not blueball you or overburden you with too much information. And each of the 13 storylines focuses on a single aspect of the overall story, minimizing even further that you get overburdened. And with the bite-sized episodes, you get a lot of control in how you want to explore these aspects and the pacing of the overall story itself. Because if you need a breather or catch up with new information, the game gives you the space and time to do so. There's no feeling of having to rush through the information or pressure to keep up. You can miss something and find it back easily afterwards. Heck, during my playthrough I was unable to play this game for almost 2 weeks, and getting back into it after a while was no problem. It only took a couple of minutes of browsing through the codex to get back in. And if I wanted to know something fast on the fly, the game had my back with the Thought Cloud system. Whenever characters, and therefore you, learn of new keywords, terms, names, events and items, you can find them in the Thought Cloud. From there you can use them to interact with characters or your surroundings, or to consider them. When you choose the latter option, characters will share inner dialogue style information and their thoughts about what you selected. Now, what I found particularly clever about this system is that it not only makes it easier to get back into the storyline or the game itself after a while, but that it kept you invested with the information itself. Information given at the start is not moved to the codex and forgotten about it as you go on. It has the tendency to change, and even at the end of everything, still matters. Overall, 13 Sentinels' story manages to be a challenge, but a rewarding and fun experience at the same time. And that is where it differentiates itself from a lot of other games that try to pull something similar. The story told is purposely challenging you at every turn, and it wants you to keep up with it and understand and puzzle it together, but it doesn't want to beat you, to throw you and all your efforts and time out of the window by some meaningless twist or turn, or make things overly complicated or confusing. Instead, it gives you everything you need, to be it tools, ways of writing, time, presentation, you name it. It does everything to give you a great puzzle/mystery solving experience, if you put some effort into it. However, despite that it's great that it manages to pull off a story like this, it is also a double-edged sword. The obvious one is that when talking about this game, you can't go into much detail about the story itself, because that would ruin a lot of fun in solving this puzzle/mystery. But there are also other issues with the story as well. To tell a story like this does mean that some other aspects get less attention or are skipped over completely. Like the game boasts that it has 13 characters, each with their own storyline, but in reality there's just one storyline. It's also hard to shape and develop a character in a story like this, let alone 13 of them. There was a lot of inconsistency there, which is there for a reason, a good one even if you ask me. However, its lacking character development and shaping was very noticeable and at times even missed. Another problem with this kind of story is that the person experiencing it must be willing to put in the effort. It's not a story where you just sit back and relax. It only works if you are thinking alongside with it actively. You also have to be rather patient at times, as sometimes you really want certain information or confirmation and you are not getting it yet. Especially at the beginning, your patience is being tested as things are still new, confusing and unknown to you, and you are craving for some stability. What for some people could also be a problem is that the gameplay is not very active. The game is a visual novel, aka it involves a lot of dialogue, listening to characters, potentially reading the codex entries and then back to more dialogue and listening. For a visual novel, it did however pick an amazing art style and combined it with a 3D effect and surprisingly detailed animations. But nonetheless, the gameplay is still not very active, as this game is mostly a visual novel. But when it's not a visual novel, it is actually a strategy game. The story might go beyond the simple premise it sets up, but the combat on the other hand sticks with it. Mechs versus Kaijus, and that's it. Okay, there is a little bit more nuance to it, but it's basically it. The combat is divided in stages, and in each stage you create a party of max 6 out of the 13 characters and fight against these Kaijus. Each Sentinel type of course has their own set of weapons, skills and overall pros and cons against certain Kaijus. Therefore it's key to create the best possible party for each combat stage and use them as effectively as possible. As you gain victories, each character will gain levels and you will earn points to improve their stats and unlock new skills. The combat stages themselves usually boil down to defending a point for an X amount of time or by defeating all Kaiju spawn on the map. And that is it. Unlike the story, the combat stays much closer to the surface level of its premise. There's not a lot beyond what is introduced at the start of the game, which is actually fine. In fact, I think it's clever to keep the combat rather simple to balance out the intensive story. However, a part of me would argue that they kept it too simple. When you engage in one of these combat stations, you are always looking at the battlefield from a bird's eye view, and the Mechs and Kaijus are represented by simple shapes and colors on it rather than complete models. Now, it actually looks cool and all, but why isn't the same art style of the visual novel more involved here? Whenever we see these Mechs and Kaijus in the story, they look absolutely brilliant. They carry impact on the screen with merely their presence. And I would have loved to see that return in the combat. Heck, with some small changes, it could have been done with the current game. Whenever you select a skill during combat or when you are in the preparation menu, you see these mechs having small, short but cool looking cutscenes displaying their skill, their power, their awesomeness. And I would have loved to see them utilize these cutscenes more, because when you browse too fast through the menu or select a skill in combat almost instantly, you will not see these cutscenes. These small cutscenes would have fit perfectly as small intermissions after you selected a skill to use on the battlefield. It would make the combat presentation carry a lot more impact, but also add a feeling of grandness to it as you are sending these mechs into battle. And that's only speaking for the mechs, because the Kaijus are treated a lot worse, because they have no fancy cutscenes or any presentation at all during the combat. If you want to see a full model of them and really grasp what you're facing, you have to see them in the story mode or look at them in a codex. The way the combat is presented here makes it feel a little bit disconnected from the main story, as its art style is a lot different. But it would also be a big help to people if the combat would look a lot better. As I would understand that people would skip out on this story because they don't enjoy this kind of combat. Because the combat is mandatory to play. You cannot progress through the story if you're not playing the combat stages. Now, thankfully, they do offer an easy mode, which makes all combat stages a cakewalk. But wouldn't it be cool to see them at least explode in a fancy, brutal mech versus kaiju action? I would say yes. But other than the combat presentation, this combat system was simple, fine, and just a lot of fun. Again, it balances great with the intensive story. And I do believe it's purposely created for that, to balance it out, to give you a moment to breathe. And that is why, despite the fact that I would like to see the mechs and kaijus be presented better, I wouldn't expect or ask more of it. 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim is a fantastic game. Its story starts off very simple but spirals in a controlled fashion into a very fun, clever mystery/puzzle solver. And unlike games that try something similar with their story, 13 Sentinels is much more accessible, as it offers you everything you need to proper follow and figure out the story it tells. On top of that, its story is told in one of the best art styles I have seen for a visual novel. Some shots in this game look absolutely amazing, and even the boring shots are still nice to look at. Combat serves as a great balancer for the story. It is flashy, fun, fast for what it is. It is, however, the element that felt the most lacking in terms of presentation. And what is worse is that it felt unnecessary, as what it needs to overcome this is already in the game. they only need to put it in more often. Still, it should not come with a surprise that I highly recommend 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim. Of course, to the people who play visual novels often or like games with more complicated stories, but I would also recommend this to people that don't play those kind of games or like those kind of stories. Because just with a little bit of patience and some effort, you will be able to follow this story through and understand what is going on. And when you do, it is a blast.